Well, welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Brian Hoke, a volunteer here at FOCUS Greater Syracuse. Each month, FOCUS presents a free forum where experts discuss citizen-driven topics and engage with attendees through question and answer. Our forums are open to the public. All are welcome. In today's forum, we strive to shed light on the grim realities of human trafficking in Central New York. We're lucky to have with us today two knowledgeable experts who are passionate about increasing awareness, detecting possible victims, and providing services to those in need. Joining us today are Elisa Morales from the New Abolitionists and Aaron Bates from the McMahon Ryan Child Advocacy Center. A big thanks to you both for being here. Aaron, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Brian. And I just wanted to start out with a big thank you to everyone that's attending today and taking the opportunity to enlighten themselves with this information. So hopefully this goes well. So like Brian mentioned, my name is Erin Bates. I'm the Deputy Director currently of Operations at McMahon Ryan Child Advocacy Center. I've had the opportunity to be here for about 10.5 years now. And I originally was hired here to be the sole advocate for our trafficking program that has since grown to multiple advocates. So that's pretty exciting, which we can talk about a little bit. And I wanted to give a little bit of background about McMahon Ryan in general, just so that everyone can understand how our trafficking work fits into our mission within the community. So McMahon Ryan, for those that don't know, we are a co-located child advocacy center, which means our multidisciplinary team members are all in one building. We are the child advocacy center for Onondaga County. So we have investigative teams, the district attorney's office, child protective, medical through Upstate Golisano Children's Hospital, therapy services, advocacy, plus, we have a wonderful outreach team that do outreach and education in our community for both adults and children. And not all CACs have that, so we're pretty lucky to have the preventive arm in our county. And they reach a lot of kids and adults throughout the year. So as much as our center is reactive to reports of abuse, we also have the preventive piece, which is pretty awesome, in my humble opinion. So outside of our co-located center, we provide advocacy services to every single child and non-offending caregiver that comes in here. Reports get to us through Child Protective Services if there's an allegation of sexual or severe physical abuse. So if a report gets made to the state central register and there's some of those allegations in there or a fatality, they will then be funneled to the specific workers over here that handle those cases. Same thing with law enforcement. So when a law enforcement report gets made having to do with any allegations that are similar to, like I just mentioned, they also get funneled over here and assigned to special abused persons unit detectives, whether that's through New York State Police, Syracuse Police, or the sheriffs. So we have jurisdictional coverage for the entire county. As far as those cases are concerned, we serve youth that are 17 years of age and under, and our advocates see those cases all the way through. So if there's no disclosure of abuse, and there was just somebody that had concerns, that advocate's going to make sure that that family has what they need to leave here feeling secure, even if there was no abuse that took place. If there is a disclosure of abuse and it's going to go through the criminal justice system or the family needs support through family court, our advocates will also accompany to those hearings and see them all the way through the process. So an example would be if you have a client come in and there's a disclosure of abuse and that goes through the criminal justice system with the district attorney's office and such, that advocate goes with that family to support them and be that consistent person throughout the whole process, all the way through grand jury, through trial if that occurs, all the way through to sentencing. And we don't close that case until that occurs. Our advocates really serve as a conduit for communication. Us being co-located is really awesome that we can just walk downstairs and talk to medical or talk to law enforcement or child protective, which kind of makes access to information easier for us. But it also makes it easier for the kids and families that are coming in here. It's a trauma-informed approach. The child comes here and is interviewed regarding the allegations and doesn't have to repeat themselves multiple times, which we know can be traumatic. And we don't want to re-victimize someone who's coming in to share their story and get justice and help and heal and all those wonderful things. So that's really why the CAC is set up the way it is. Now fitting into that, you have human trafficking. So our program started back in 2010. We had in New York State, there was a Safe Harbor Act that was passed, and it was really child focused, which was new. And not all states have safe harbor legislation. New York State is one of 17 states nationally that have these safe harbor laws pertaining to kids being exploited or trafficked. And this kind of stems from the Trafficking Victims Protection Act that was passed in 2000, which really kind of was the first piece of legislation that identified human trafficking as having victims. A lot of people were, not a lot of people, I mean, before that it was prostitution and seen as a choice that people were making to engage in sex work. And the TVPA kind of flipped that around a little bit and began that paradigm shift and really looking at, that crime as having victims, and maybe not so much having a choice, and kind of being pushed into that work. Now, moving past the Victims Protection Act into Safe Harbor, like I mentioned, that was more of a state legislation piece and having to do with children. New York State kind of pushed that to our county. Our county was lucky enough to receive funding to start up a program for that, which is how I ended up being hired for that program. And like I said before, that was really the start of a paradigm shift in our community too, because when I first started doing this work, there was a lot of confusion about what was trafficking, what did it look like. There's a lot of myths and misconceptions out there. So a lot of my early work in this field was around education and letting people know what it looks like, because what you see in the movies and on TV and what's virally shared on the internet isn't necessarily what we're seeing in Syracuse, New York. And actually amongst children, it could be very different. Another piece to that is that safe harbor is very broad and it's meant to be that way. We know that trafficking victims don't always present as such. They might present as a different victim of a different crime. They might present as someone who's in a relationship with somebody. It might mimic other crimes, right? Like, so you have someone who's experiencing what we would think on a face level as domestic violence, but the further you dig, there might be indications that potentially that's a coerced or a forced relationship. And you wouldn't know that at face value. So with trafficking, a lot of the work is really getting to the root of the issue with these victims, especially with kids, which I will get to. But we'll talk about the program first. And a lot of stuff that I have to say will be covered in questions. So I'm going to try and keep this short so that I don't run over my time. Keep me on track, Brian. Sorry. So we work with youth that have been identified as being at risk of trafficking and youth that have disclosed being trafficked. So like I mentioned before, it's a very broad identification program. It's built that way on purpose. The state put together that screening tool. They are the only ones. So our CPS workers are mandated entities that need to screen every single child that they come in contact with for signs and risk factors of trafficking. They are the only one that's mandated, but our agency adopted that screening tool as part of our intake process. And that was really because we need to know where we're starting. Like, what's the baseline with this kiddo that's being referred, right? So there's different levels to identification and risk. So there's a medium, a high, and then there's a federal. The federal is the highest one. That's basically you have a kid that represents as a true trafficking victim per the TVPA, or the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. So that's pretty much that they're disclosing, yes, I'm being exploited or trafficked and A, B, and C, right? Then you have the high risk category, which is more or less pretty risky behaviors. Maybe they've come home with weird tattoos, or they're coming home with unaccounted for money or goods. They're seen in trafficking hotspots, all those kinds of things. And then you have the medium level, and really that is just a beginning threshold, right? So individuals that come in and are identified as medium risk might need help with staying consistent with school, or making some better choices. They're not necessarily being identified because they're super at risk of trafficking, or we think that's absolutely what's happening to that kiddo. They just need a little support and some mentoring. So our advocates work with the non-offending parent if they're involved, and that child to get them into some community supports. So realistically, our program, like I mentioned before, we work with kids, but that program goes up to 21 years of age, and that's different from the CAC. You might remember I mentioned in the beginning that we work with 17 and under. And the trafficking program is different because we know that youth that are involved in systems, specifically the child welfare system, are exponentially more at risk to experience trauma, or already have, and probably are more vulnerable than most. And so for those that aren't aware, kiddos can remain in care until they're 21 years of age. And so we didn't want to cut that off at 17, especially since we know the median age that we're seeing is anywhere between 14 and 16. So if we cut it off at 17, that doesn't give us a lot of time to work with them. So that program cuts off at 21 for that reason. We utilize trauma-informed best practices with these kiddos. Our advocates meet with them at least twice a month, but realistically, it's more than that, depending on what they have going on, the type of case that they have. If they're really high need, then they might see them more than once a week. But our advocates are always texting, on the phone, checking in with caregivers, service providers, really just trying to make those connections within the community to stabilize that youth. Our number one goal in this program is to really support and stabilize. And we do that by building rapport. A lot of these youth have pre-existing trauma or negative experiences with authority, or the already in place systems that they might be a part of. And we really try not to add to that. We're going to meet these kids where they're at. If it's safe, we're going to have conversations around safety planning, goals that they have. What needs do you have? If it's as basic as shampoo and conditioner, then we got you. We can do that, right? We can make it work. If you need directions to a food pantry, let's get you there. Do you need a bus card? We can get you there. If you need a ride to an appointment, our advocates are doing that. They will transport clients if needed, not on a regular basis, because we do have some that try to take advantage of that. But if kids are having some barriers, we try to break through those. Another thing that we experience is housing issues. That's an issue with our adults in our community, and it's also an issue with our homeless kiddos, the ones that are couch surfing or don't have a reliable parent at home. We see a lot of that. We also have a lot of work to be done in our systems, because these kiddos don't necessarily have the documents that they need to do things like birth certificates, IDs, driver's licenses, social security cards. They don't have those. They don't know how to get them. Our advocates work with the systems that are in place to get what we can, but sometimes we hit some barriers with that too. And there's been some issues with caregivers not wanting to give over documents, but that's not necessarily deemed safe by the child to go back home to get those documents. As you can imagine, it gets a little messy. So we do a lot of work with trying to come to understanding with that between non-offending caregivers and the kiddos, just to make sure that they're taken care of. I have to check my notes. Hold. our advocates are really providing a lot of intense case management, and it differs a little bit than the advocacy that's provided at the CAC. We offer all the same things, therapy and medical, but the trafficking program is really more intense case management because it's more one-on-one with the youth themselves and a lot more support and rapport building. And I know I keep saying that, but to these youth, the rapport piece is the most important. We want them to trust us. A lot of these youth are out and about in the community, and if they run into an issue, we want them to feel comfortable calling us if they need something or if something goes wrong. We want them to be able to feel like they have somebody in their corner, and that's the most important piece to our program. And our advocates do a wonderful job at making sure that the clients that we have feel that and feel comfortable coming to them to ask for what they need. I think that was it in a nutshell. How'd I do on time, Brian? Okay.
Perfect. That was great.
All right.
Thank you. And
You're welcome.
Elisa, we'll turn it over to you.
That sounds great. So my name is Elisa Morales, and first I'll start with one of my primary hats, which is the executive director of La Liga, which is also known as the Spanish Action League. I'm very lucky in my role that I get to lead a team of angels earning their wings on earth every day right there at La Liga, and I'm very proud of the work that we do. So we have been a cornerstone in our community for 55 years. With an array of services through our programs, which are health and wellness, family support, youth leadership and development, housing and careers. And then we also have language services for interpretation, translation of the Spanish language. But I'm here to talk to you in my abolitionist role and hat. For decades, I've crossed paths with the invisible people that walk amongst us, which are human trafficking victims. And I'm going to talk to you a lot about what's happening here in Syracuse, but I do want to explain a little bit about, what trafficking is. And then we'll get into a little bit more specifics of what I've seen here in Syracuse, New York, because in the decades that I've been working, most of what I've seen and what I've learned and experienced has been right here in Syracuse. So human trafficking does not discriminate. It can happen to anyone, anywhere, anytime. Most people think that slavery was abolished with Abraham Lincoln. Obviously, after hearing Aaron, it wasn't. So in fact, modern day slavery, it not only exists, it's also thriving. It's a global phenomenon that's happening right now in every country, including the United States. The US has the greatest concentration of trafficked persons in the state of New York, California, Florida, and Washington, D.C. The United Nations estimates that there's 2.5 million victims of human trafficking. Other figures range from like 4 million to 28 million. I have to say, this is a lucrative, fast-paced industry, and data tracking is very lacking. So the numbers are much higher than what we can imagine. Human trafficking is the largest and the fastest growing profitable criminal activity in the entire world. It has surpassed weapons trafficking. It will surpass drug trafficking. The reason why is because a drug you could use once, but a human being you could use over and over and over again. And that's money for a trafficker because it's all about the mighty dollar bill. Human trafficking is the exploitation of human beings to make money. And victims are frequently most trafficked into like forced labor, forced prostitution, and domestic servitude. So we do have a lot of diplomats who are bringing our international victims in as, people who are doing like maybe they're taking care of their garden, maybe they're taking care of their babies as a nanny, or maybe they're bringing them in as just housekeepers. But really, once they're here, they can do what they want with them and they'll sell them forward just like if they were a piece of merchandise or just property. Victims are tricked, forced, and they're coerced into slavery. And a lot of times traffickers will prey on those who dream, that American dream that foreigners are so enamored with, and they want to come to our country because they want to do well for themselves and also for their families and send money back home. That's really a draw for people, but it's not quite the way it works once they're actually trafficked across into American soil. Victims are often trafficked also by the people that they know. So a lot of times a trafficked person may become someone who is working for a trafficker, not necessarily by choice, although I'm sure that there are some benefits financially to crossing the role from being, the sex trafficked person to the person who's actually taking care of all the sex trafficked persons. But they are really like boyfriends, a lot of online dating opportunities there with 90-day fiance, those visas and different things. And once people again are on American soil again, it turns out to be a really big surprise. Once the people are trapped, they're forced to work many times long hours, live in inhumane conditions with like little or no pay. The threats of violence are used against them all the time. Victims suffer from physical and emotional abuse, rape, and even death. And death is something that runs very high amongst traffickers. A human trafficking victim's life is not, their time span or lifespan isn't always very long. Sometimes they only live up to 2 years for many reasons. For one, they're subjected to the elements, they're subjected to horrible, quote unquote, working conditions. They're not getting any kind of medical care and they're not eating enough. Some of them will commit suicide within that first 2 year time span that they are trafficked. Victims have their documents taken away from them and they're forced to pay off false debts. These debts will never be paid off because once a trafficker invests money into a trafficking victim, they're not only incurring that debt to pay off, but then if they feed them or buy them clothes, if they're housing them, even if they sell them forward, those debts go forward with that trafficking victim. Does it happen in Syracuse? Absolutely. Like I said, I've been doing this for a really long time, and most of what I've seen has been right here in Syracuse, New York. Syracuse is centrally located. We have an international airport, a bus and train station, and during the winter months when the river between Canada and New York State freeze, victims are driven over that frozen river. Many are branded like cattle, have SKU codes, just like you would see in a store on their bodies, and they're also tattooed to identify who they belong to because they are seen as merchandise or property. They're not seen as human beings. And I've actually seen these things. I've seen them quite a bit, but I have seen these things over the years that I've been working with victims. Babies here in Syracuse, New York are born into slavery. And again, they're born with a debt that they will not be able to pay off. Many traffickers will impregnate their property so that they have something to hold over their heads. So I'll take care of the baby, but you've got to go out and you've got to make so much money for me, or we're not going to be able to keep this baby. So this is always a way that traffickers are going to try to use their power and their control over their victims. I'm a survivor of domestic and sexual violence, and I've worked with other victims over the years that I see as trampled spirits. But in my opinion, a human trafficking victim is a broken spirit. Traffickers are their word. If they say that they're going to kill your family, they will. It's just as easy as a phone call. So even if your family sold you into slavery, it doesn't make a difference. Traffickers know that that person will do anything that they are said, that they are told to do so that they can avoid having their families hurt. They also don't want to be hurt, but they do get hurt very often. And they're also disposable. So if during the course of the work that they're doing or just a regular beating, which they endure very often, if they happen to die, it's okay because John and Jane Does are all over America. And a lot of them have trafficking stamped right on them. We just don't recognize it. We don't realize that the invisible people walk amongst us because we don't see the chains. Some people don't look like they're that they're stuck in a bad situation. They don't show it because they're very well trained by their traffickers. And traffickers are very, very good at what they do to make sure that their property stays their property and that they behave no matter, even if they're walking through the mall or a grocery store or through a park. They know better than to act out or to try to, do anything because the repercussions are just immediate and they're so harsh. Traffickers also, there's a lot of things here that traffickers do in Syracuse, New York. For one, we're known as a holding spot for victims of internet virginity. I'm not saying that it's eBay, but it works like eBay. You see a piece of merchandise, item that you want to purchase. There's a bidding war. A lot of times with internet virginity, we're holding those virgins here. And they're usually foreign nationals that are 12 years or younger, because that is what is a hot commodity throughout the world, but also here in the United States. So a bidding war starts, and about $25,000 or so later, that person not only gets to take that girl's virginity, they also get to keep them. They may take care of their house, their children. They're not going to go to school or have any advantages like that, but they are able to sell them forward as well. A trend that started in New York many years ago is that internet virginity is a hot commodity. So why not just sew that hymen up a few times a day and resell that poor young girl over and over again? And it doesn't matter if she can have children in the future. It doesn't matter if she's in pain. It doesn't matter if she could die from the experience, because they're making money and there's another girl right behind her. We've got to keep in mind that the United States is a melting pot. So although we have a lot of international victims that are being forced across our borders, we also have our own American citizen children, men and women who are also subject to human trafficking. And it happens every single day, especially, I could say, here in Syracuse, New York, because I have seen it many times. What else happens in Syracuse? The rehoming, or the foster children. Sometimes foster children are, quote unquote, spending the night at a friend's house over the weekend or maybe during break, but really they're just being moved to another location where they're fresh meat and they can be sold over and over again throughout the day. And that does happen, unfortunately, here. We're also holding place for 8mm snuff films. Those are films where people are repeatedly and just brutally raped and tortured to the death. And we do have, unfortunately, sick people who will pay a lot of money for films like that and watch them over and over again until they get tired of it. And then they'll just look to buy another 8mm film. If you live in a neighborhood I'm an animal lover, so I bring this up a lot because it happens too much. If you live in a neighborhood with stray cats, there's a cat colony, and you start noticing that those cats are disappearing because they're reproducing all the time. So there's always kittens, stray kittens and stray puppies, pregnant animals that traffickers will take in. You should ask yourself, if those cat colonies are disappearing and there was no spay or neuter program coming through, there was no rescue who's looking to rehome them, then you may want to wonder who might be in your neighborhood at that time. Traffickers do move very often because they're moving merchandise. They're not looking to get caught. They're very smart about what it is that they do. But with the cat colonies, imagine that you're a child from another country. You don't know where you are. You don't speak the language. And all of a sudden your trafficker comes with this puppy or kitten and gives it to you. That trafficker knows that the probability is very high that that child is going to bond with that animal immediately. They're going to give them time to bond with that animal. And then one day they'll come in and they'll say, you know what, let me hold the kitty. We're going to go for a ride. And then when we get to the place, I'm going to still hold on to the kitty here, but you're going to take your clothes off and we're going to take pictures. And if you cry, the kitty's not going to eat, and neither are you. Now, this is already a hungry child who's now thinking about, oh my goodness, if I don't do what I have to do, if I don't behave, not only am I in trouble, not only can I get hurt, they may hurt my kitten or my puppy, or we're not going to eat. And that happens all the time. So again, traffickers are really smart, resourceful people, and they will do whatever they have to do to make sure that they're making money and that their merchandise is making them more money until they can't anymore, and then they're just replaced. So what can you do? For one, you're doing it now. You're educating yourself about the topic of human trafficking, because modern day slavery does exist, and it exists not in other countries, but here. Share what you learn with others, because you never know if the person you're talking to, you may share a resource or a story, and somebody who's in a situation that you're not even aware of, you may save that life. Another thing you can do is to donate time And if you can, money. Volunteers, we can't do anything without them in our, agencies. And, there's a lot of people that are donating time, but money also helps. Funding is very scarce for human trafficking. I wish there was more so that we could really combat this better than what we do, but we are all doing the best that we can with the resources that we do have. And being that we're in New York State, which is one of the largest transits of modern day slavery, this is something that's important. But this can help us to combat slavery. Form delegations and or participate in Legislative Awareness Day. Keep in mind that our public servants are voted by the people for the people. Your voice, and especially a collective voice, can make a huge difference for the laws, the enforcement, and the funding to combat human trafficking. Don't put yourself in harm's way. I would never suggest that to anyone. If you think you see something, if your gut is telling you that you may be observing or that there may be a human trafficking situation either in front of you or in your area, please contact authorities immediately and let them know what it is that you've observed so that they can help to combat this, from a legal and authority perspective. I'm going to end in sharing a story that I have shared many, many times. One of the human trafficking victims that I worked with years and years ago when I first started doing this work was right here in Syracuse, New York. And she told me the story of, her journey as a slave. And she was telling me that, she's from Thailand and she lived in a very poor area. Poverty was everywhere. She was from a very large family. And one day her father had a cow who happened to eat in someone else's property. It incurred a debt. And it was a debt that her dad and her parents couldn't pay. So one day her rich uncle from the big city came in. He was going to come and take care of that debt. He sat and talked with his father until she was called in. And he did pay the debt, but it was in exchange for her. And that day, she told me that she was raped brutally right in front of her father. He did nothing. She wasn't allowed to say goodbye to her mother. She wasn't allowed to say goodbye to her brothers and sisters. She went with her uncle, and he had many wives, and all of his wives and their children, even children that were younger than her, they all beat her up. They all, treated her poorly. He had a lot of different parties where she was the subject of, first, she was something brand new, a new piece of meat to put on the tray for everyone to pass around. So he was making money off of her. And then 2 years later, there must have been another debt at her parents' property because her younger sister, who was 4 years old, came in. She was sold at that point. She couldn't believe that she didn't even get to hug her sister or talk to her or warn her about anything. She was trafficked to many countries. She said that many moons passed, and no matter what country she ended up at or what language they spoke, everything was exactly the same. She was still enslaved. One day she ends up right here in Syracuse, New York, walking through our mall of all places. She was walking with her trafficker, and he didn't have a chain or a muzzle. He didn't have her in a cage. He didn't have a leash on her. He just freely walked through the mall with her. And she said that that day in particular stood out to her because a stranger who was walking by happened to make eye contact with her, and he just simply smiled. And she said that for that moment, she felt human. And she was 18 now. She had been over a decade enslaved. And she said she felt human. And she wanted to feel that again. And somehow, through our fortune, we were able to cross paths. At that time, I was working for Vera House, who's still doing really good work as well. And we were able to get her help. And now, all these years later, she is still free. And she does live in her country of Thailand. However, she has no communication with her family because that wouldn't be safe. And she dedicates her life to helping other human trafficking victims that through her rescue are able to come and cross paths with her so that she can help them as well, so that they can be free and have good lives. Now, I know that Aaron is listening to this, and she's already thinking what they would do if she was a child who was at McMahon Ryan. There's so many resources and so many great people on her team who would be able to step in. Most human trafficking victims are not going to have this disadvantage. And so the last thing I will say is, as far as what you can do, you know, we live in a fast-paced world. People used to actually talk and engage in conversation. We're so busy and we're so in our phones that somebody might say hi and we'll like nod to them and keep on walking. But if you come across anybody in your journeys and your travels every single day, don't deny a stranger a simple smile, because you don't know if you're going to impact that person. A lot of us are having a bad day in general, or we're challenged by life in general. So even just sharing a smile, I'm not saying engage or have the conversation, but I'm just saying be mindful as you go through your day to day, and don't deny anyone a smile, because even if it's for that moment, you may have helped someone who is not treated like a human feel like one. So thank you all for your time and attention, and for allowing Erin and I to share the information that we have today, so that, you know, we can all be part of this collective effort to combat human trafficking. Thank you.
Thanks, Elisa, and thanks, Erin, to you as well for your remarks. I'm sure I'm not alone in thinking this is tough to listen to, right? And I'm sure I'm not alone among the folks here in knowing that this is good to hear, right? An important topic about which I certainly know too little, and I'm guessing that is true for others. We had questions submitted in advance. I'll cover a few of those in the time we have remaining. You're welcome to put questions in the Q&A or chat. If we can get to them, we will. Certainly the most common thread that ran through the questions we got in advance were, what can people do? And Elisa, you touched on it. I think, Erin, you may have as well. But just from a mechanical standpoint, if I suspected something or had cause to be concerned, would I call the police? Would I call your agencies? What might one do? And you know, that just was such a prevalent theme among the questions we got that I'd appreciate, even though you touched on it already, hearing more about how that might work.
So if I could, and I'll put it in the chat, there is a national human trafficking hotline that works for all states. It's an 800 number. They also have a TTY. They also will text, and there is a website for them. So I would say to learn as much as you can. And, you know, the human trafficking hotline is not just for human trafficking victims to call, but also for anyone who has any kind of questions. You might see something suspicious, but also know who's providing the services in your area, but also know what law enforcement, numbers are, because there are dedicated departments that will work with human trafficking. So learn who they are, what those numbers are, so that you can give them a tip or you can ask any questions. But definitely the human trafficking hotline, I think, is a great resource in general for people. And then I'll turn it over to Erin, because Erin, maybe if you could put your number in the chat too for McMahon Ryan, that would be helpful as well.
Yeah, so I was going to mention the hotline that you mentioned. We are a resource. They do it geographically, so you have to register your agency if you provide service and the type of service that you provide. So if anyone reaches out to the national hotline and is looking to get in touch with McMahon Ryan, you can do it that way. I will also put our phone number in the chat. It's not uncommon for us to receive phone calls with people that are unsure about what to do in a situation that they experience. I would urge you, if it's within Onondaga County and you're unsure, potentially trafficking, and you're unsure about calling law enforcement even, go ahead and call us. Myself and the other trafficking advocates would be happy to help talk it through and see where we can go with it, or at least direct you to a resource.
Got it. Good. Thank you both. I guess relatedly, and Michelle just posted it in the chat, and certainly some of the questions we received in advance, and I think you both touched on it in your remarks. What are signs? You know, I mean, obviously you don't want to falsely accuse somebody, but at the same time, it is a serious problem, and you want to be aware. What might lead a concerned citizen to speak up and say, "Hey, I think there's trafficking going on, and this young person, perhaps needs help." What, are there tips you can give beyond what you shared already that might be helpful for the folks here today?
Mhm. For our youth, I always say that conversation is important, paying attention to hygiene, again, the unaccounted for money or goods, if they're running away from home very often. And I'm saying all of these things, whereas there's no one that's standing out more than another, right?
Mhm.
So like if you have a youth that's not going to school and they're running away from home, that could be any number of things going on. But if you don't have a conversation, you don't know. And if you do have that conversation, not only are you letting that youth know that you care, but you might actually uncover more information that might lead them to share with you about maybe an overly controlling partner, or that partner forcing them to do things or coercing them to do things that they don't necessarily want to do,
Mhm.
and getting to know that kid that way. There's any number of signs and symptoms of trafficking, which I could probably email to you all. I don't know if you're able to send documents out following our panel today,
Mhm.
but I do have a list of some of those things. If people are interested in that, I'm happy to send that along.
Yeah, be great. We can make sure that gets posted perhaps with the recording that we put up
Sure.
on our website. Yeah, that'd be great. Anything you could share.
Okay.
Elisa, did you want to come in on this too?
No, I actually agree with Aaron, and I think just it starts at home. Have those conversations with your children and
Mhm.
your family members. The younger they are, the better, just so that they know that these things do happen. I don't want people to keep their kids at home and not go out and have fun or do any kind of sports or go to the mall, but it's important for them to be aware of some warning signs, or just that this exists, so that if something feels funny in their gut, it may actually be something they should stay away from. And they
Mhm.
should also, if they're going out, they should be do the buddy system, because there's nothing more attractive to a trafficker than seeing somebody on their own. Even I would say wherever there's an opportunity where people are displaced. So even if there's a natural disaster, if there's a pandemic, if there's different situations like that, traffickers are way ahead of the ball. So they are looking, even though you don't see them, they definitely see you way before they come in contact with you. Many times they're watching you.
Mhm.
Well, they're
Gotcha.
very calculated, right? This isn't an opportunistic crime. So I agree with that 100%. They're paying attention. They like to recruit by building relationships, right? It's easier to get people to do what you want them to do when they trust you. And that's really at the basis of things here. And having conversations with your kids, like Elisa said, 100% agree. Having them understand what a healthy relationship looks like,
Mhm.
what boundaries are, self-love, self-appreciation, things like that. A lot of the youth that we interact with, unfortunately, don't know what a healthy relationship looks like, which makes them more vulnerable. They just want someone to care about them. And unfortunately, even though this person that's caring about them is making them do horrendous things, they still are putting them in a house, taking care of them. They can shower, they're feeding them. And those things are important because this is survival, right? So a lot of these youth that we're interacting with, they don't see anything wrong with it because they're out here just trying to survive.
Mhm. Got it. We had a question about terminology, how we talk about this, right? And Elisa, you used the term slavery several times in your remarks, and human trafficking is, I imagine, a legal term. In addition, for asking for more clarity on what exactly constitutes human trafficking. Well, I'll ask that first, and then I have a follow-up to this question. But how is human trafficking defined?
So it's defined as a person who is forced or coerced into, it could be the sex trade, it could be the labor trade, it could be, servitude. It could be a number of things, but it's forced or coerced People are not just waking up one day and saying, you know, I need a career change. Let me be a slave now. You know, there's no one who does that, you know, and they're very, like Erin said, calculated. They're so smart about how they approach people. So it could be by inflicting fear. It could be simply by tricking them into trusting them, making them think they're in love with them, or, you know, if it's a relationship situation. So they're very resourceful. I mean, they're smart. And this is why human trafficking continues to make the money it does, because they, wherever there's a stumbling block, they overcome it. Wherever, you know, there's some sort of challenge, they figure it out pretty quickly, because it's really just a business for them.
Got it. Erin, you mentioned, and I was struck by how recent some of the legislation here in New York State was, right? And no doubt this was a crime, a challenge posed to young people for decades, centuries, right? But how recently some of that came up. In addition to talking about how things have evolved, I imagine the nomenclature, right? The terms we use just to describe this have changed over time. We probably wouldn't have said human trafficking 50 years ago. Just curious what either of you can say as relates terminology, or just what you've seen in your professional experience over the years, how we as a society, in particular with our laws, have changed to address the situation.
So I think where we were 20 years ago is not where we are now. It's not going to be where we will be in 20 years from now, because this is something that continues to evolve on both sides. You know, from the people who are trafficking to the people who are trafficked to the people who are also combating that trafficking. So it's hard to keep up with the terminology, to be honest with you. Sometime I will say that in my experience, women in particular who are forced into prostitution do not like to be called prostitutes, but yet they're referred to as prostitutes. They're treated by law enforcement sometimes, you know, like this is just a prostitute pulling a trick or turning a trick, but that's not the case. And also, you know, with the Trafficking Victim Protection and Justice Act, that TVPJA that Erin's brought up a few times, you know, that does work a bit with terminology, and also holds the quote unquote John, who's the person who's purchasing the other person for the sex act. You know, they used to get like a slap on the wrist just by saying, oh, I thought she was 18. They get to go home to their kids and their pets and their family, where young girls who are under 18 are arrested for prostitution. And our American citizen kids who have been arrested for prostitution sometimes find it hard to get out of that lifestyle and that trade, because they're discriminated against for jobs in the future, even jobs, you know, from entry level or trying to do something more, you know, get higher education and try to get jobs, you know, that record will always follow them. But people don't always have the understanding of, you know, was this just something that this person did when they were young? Is this something they chose to do? They usually think it is, but most of the times they're not. And children don't make choices like that. They don't even know what these sex acts are. So someone is forcing them into doing these sex acts.
Got it. And Erin, apologies if I'm stepping on your comment, but just to follow up, Elisa, you mentioned that we're not where we are today, where we were 20 years ago, right? And is it moving in a positive direction from your perspective? How we're dealing with this from a legal or societal standpoint?
So, you know, because I was doing this 20 years ago, I will say that a lot of the frustrations and the lack of collaboration that existed because of the lack of, you know, just awareness. And even with, you know, service providers bumping heads with law enforcement, you know, they want to get the bad guy. They want to get the ring. They want to arrest people and put them in jail. But we're looking at this human being like, do they need clothes? Do they need medical? Do they need an attorney? Do they need some emotional support? Like, what do they need? We're assessing these things right out of the gate. And yes, we want to make sure that the people who are doing that the traffickers and the quote unquote Johns are held accountable. We also want to make sure that that human being is being, you know, treated as such and is being taken care of first. And then we move forward with, you know, what we can do as far as their going to be someone who will testify against their trafficker. Most of them won't. But what can we do while we have them, across from us? What do they need? I'm not sure what Erin's thought is on that.
I
Yeah.
agree wholeheartedly, but I think there was somebody, a number of years ago when I first started doing this work that kind of equated the movement for human trafficking, and justice for those victims to the domestic violence movement. And at one point it was okay to beat your spouse, and it was discussed like it was normal, right? And it took a number of years for us to put provisions in place to make that not okay and let it be known in our community and our society that that wasn't okay, and that there needed to be services for those that were experiencing that. And I think that the legislative pieces have moved us in the right direction, but we're still not where we're going to be. Like Elisa mentioned, we're not where we're going to be 15, 20 years from now. I think that the legislation was very important because of that paradigm shift in understanding of prostitutes, and that they're not that, and that they're actually victims of a sort, right, of a crime. And the understanding that there's this illusion of choice that these individuals experience when you're in between a rock and a hard place. I mean, you're homeless on the streets, no clothes, no food, or you take up sex work because someone says they're going to take care of you and house you. That's kind of a crappy situation to be in. And then to have individuals that come across you treat you as though you made that choice, that's the life you chose, now you have to endure the consequences. That's not really fair either, especially with kiddos who can't legally consent to any type of sexual act anyway.
Got it. Thank you.
And,
How can
I
people-
think that
Sorry.
in addition to the legislation, I've seen where, legislation has come a long way, but the enforcement has to be stronger. And I think 20 years from now, at least I'm hoping that Erin and I will do another panel and we're going to say, you know what, we're finally there. Because there are a lot of really good people that are fighting hard to make sure that it's not just the laws, but that the laws are actually being enforced so that people could be held accountable who are committing these crimes against these children and other people as well.
Got it. Last question, just because it's come up so often, both in the chat and what we got in advance. How can people volunteer? I know you both touched on it, but what can people do to help address this problem as concerned, interested citizens here today?
Elisa, did you want to go first?
Sure. So I think that for one, if you are getting educated and you're spreading, you're raising awareness with your friends, your family, you are already volunteering. You are already part of, the solution for us to be able to get the word out and make sure that as many people as possible know that this is not a problem in other countries, although it is, but it is happening right here in our country, state, and our city. Because honestly, they'll tell someone else who will tell someone else. And before you know it, we will have more and more, I think we'll have more and more of a, I'm thinking in Spanish, but I think we'll have more and more of a solution to what a lot of our gaps will be, filling those gaps and building those bridges a little bit easier, because it is kind of hard. We do bump into the wall very often because we don't have the resources we need or the collaborations that we need. But we keep moving forward. That's the whole thing, is to do that. And if you know that there's an agency that is looking for volunteers, volunteer in your faith communities. If you go to a faith community, a lot of faith communities really push that TVPJA to where it is. And you want to talk about the Underground Railroad. There are a lot of faith communities that are housing human trafficking victims. And those are numbers that we don't even know about, that they're moving people to safety from one city to another, and even from one country to another, just to make sure that that person is safe. So anytime you can have voice, use your voice and make sure that people know.
Great, thanks. Erin, any last thoughts on that topic?
Education and awareness is always my number one response to that. The more you educate yourself, the more you're going to notice in your community. Because like we have both mentioned, this is not something that's going to present itself boldly. You're going to have to dig a little bit to kind of notice it. But my other piece too is I know there was a question regarding if somebody saw something they weren't sure and what do they do with that. I always tell people if you see something that you're unsure of, Elisa mentioned this too, call it into law enforcement. I always tell the story about how there was a massage parlor in Cicero that actually got busted for trafficking, I believe. And the individual that called that into law enforcement actually called McMahon Ryan and spoke with me and wanted to know what to do with their information. They were basically seeing people come in and out. People weren't leaving at night to go home. They assumed that people were staying there. All of those things, call law enforcement. If you are thinking something shady is going on, Elisa mentioned it earlier, trust your gut. More often than not, that's going to be accurate.
Got it. Well, thank you both, Aaron Bates, Elisa Morales. Thanks for sharing your thoughts here, for educating us on this important topic, and for the work you do. It was an interesting and useful session, so we appreciate it. And thank you all, participants who came to hear about this important topic. Focus provides these mostly monthly. Most months we have a free forum of about an hour's duration, most of the time virtual. And anybody is welcome. You can find on our website a list of upcoming fora. And as always, if you like to kick in a little donation to help this cause and the other work that Focus does, we certainly appreciate it. So best wishes to everybody for a great afternoon and a great weekend. Take care.